Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 13. For a disorienting moment, Hannibal saw two Wills, one in a gentleman's proper gear, the other in a beautiful, expensive day gown with a parasol shielding her from the sun, her glossy dark curls piled atop her head, and a smirk on her full mouth. It was the smirk that startled him, rather more full of viciousness than Hannibal expected, and it immediately put him off. He stepped closer to Will without being aware of it, tensing in response to an unspoken threat. "Mina," Will breathed, every bit of love he'd ever felt for her welling to the surface. She looked so effortlessly beautiful, a petal blush on her creamy skin, her blue eyes sparkling with good health, her long lashes as curled and perfect as her dark hair. "My sad little mirror," she teased, reaching up with a gloved hand to cup his cheek as she always had. "We're less alike now than we were." Her blue eyes flicked to Hannibal, and she said, "Good afternoon, Lord Clarges." "Lady Rathmore," Hannibal said, focusing on where her hand lay on Will's cheek and how bespelled he seemed. "I've been anticipating meeting you for, some 6 years now?" She cocked her head and laughed, a floating and contrived sound, but at least she dropped her hand. "You must have Will in a panic with that infamous tongue of yours," she said, smiling at them both. "Sadly he has not yet had the benefit of my tongue," Hannibal said, pleased when Will blushed and Mina's blue eyes widened just slightly in startlement. "Since I've returned there has been nothing but throwing of valuables, arguing, and an astonishing amount of violence." Mina looked pained, a thread of nervousness shading the furtive flick of her eyes from Hannibal to Will, as if seeking proof of abuse on his pale skin. With a smirk of pure relish, Hannibal added, "I have no idea how anyone survives him, frightening as he is." "Frightening as he is, Lord Clarges?" she asked, her voice small. Will angled a look at him, torn between laughter and outrage, but it was enough to nudge him out of his momentary surprise. He smiled despite himself when Hannibal looked down at him and said, "Just look at him. Ferocious and prickly. Yes, there is an unbearable plethora of sharpness given on a daily basis, I'm afraid." "Shame on you, Will, for abusing him so," Mina said, following it with a sultry laugh that sounded quite practiced to Hannibal's discerning ear. "The gossip is backwards on that count." "It can be dangerous to listen to gossip," Hannibal warned her. "I'm very glad that I did not listen to those rumors that you were having an affair with an actor. How very mortifying that would be for you, if people listened to such things." Will sighed, and Mina looked furious, a faint crease in her brow smoothing quickly when she realized it. "Will you excuse us, Lord Clarges?" she asked, looping her hand through Will's arm. "I would like to catch up with my brother." Hannibal was reluctant to do so, but said with a strained smile, "Will doesn't require my permission in anything, Lady Rathmore." His gaze lingered on Will's troubled face, and he felt the strangest inclination to accompany him. Instead, he watched them begin on the stone path around the lake, so alike in so many respects that it was uncanny. "Lord Clarges, there you are! I've been dying to speak to you."
"If only I was so lucky,"
Hannibal breathed, and pasted on a smile that surely must look as every bit as false as it felt.
"Mina, what are you doing here?"
Will asked, his initial surprise at seeing his sister fading to curiosity.
"Darling, after that frightening letter you wrote me, what did you expect I would do?"
she asked, tipping her head to him.
"Tell me, has that terrible husband of yours given you any suspicions with his actions since your accident?"
"No, Mina, nothing,"
Will said, anxiety rising inside of him with her words.
"I am not even sure it was by his hand, in all honesty. I acted in haste, in thoughtless haste. I would never say he is behaving as he should, but he is making an effort to be polite to me."
"To get close enough to harm you, you mean? Men like that never change, dearest, believe me."
"Honestly, Mina, I should never have written my unfounded fears to you. I was just frightened,"
she said, hugging his arm in hers. Will found the soft brush of her skirts against his leg, the familiar scent of her skin, the nearness of her and pressure of her arm on his were all things he had missed and adored, things that soothed his growing worry.
"Will, someone has tried to kill you. Considering your husband's reputation, it takes little imagination to lay it at his feet."
I was informed that there had been another in his past who has thwarted him, and perhaps paid with their life," Will reluctantly told her, concern furrowing his brow when he thought of Matthew's warning. "I had no idea to whom he referred or under what circumstances, but it gives me pause."
"As well it should. There is terrible gossip about your husband, Will, and I believe it is just what this person was hinting at,"
Mina said, halting when Will stopped in his tracks to look at her.
"I don't normally pay attention to such things, but considering he is here now, back in his ancestral home with you, I felt I should tell you, Will, as you have suffered one accident already, that it might not be the last."
"Mina," Will said, his rapid turn to retreat forcing her to grasp his face again, staring into his mirroring blue eyes.
"Will, listen to me and listen well. Lord Clarges was married once before, for a short time only, right before he took on his commission. Indeed, he fled to the military to escape possible charges for her death, the late Lady Clarges."
Will stilled in her grasp, a deep and terrible fear rising up inside of him that he didn't want to acknowledge, didn't want to be true.
"They were married less than a month, Will, and she died under such mysterious circumstances that no one properly knows what happened,"
Mina said, leaning close to hiss the words against his ear.
"His grandfather made discreet compensation to her family and cleared the way for his return home. Will, I would never dare repeat such unfounded misery, but I fear for your safety."
"I have been 6 years at Hertford House," Will began, unwilling to believe it could be true, his thoughts snaring on the fact that Hannibal had been married once before, unbeknownst to himself.
"And he has been 6 years away," she cut in, overriding him. "Will, listen to me. If he is back now, it is only to be rid of you, and this episode you described only confirms it. He has murdered a wife once already, by all designs one of his choosing, who happened to displease him somehow. How much more danger are you in, Omega that you are, when he could easily be rid of you?"
Will pulled away from her grip, rejecting it, but the seed was already planted. His eyes traveled back to Hannibal, a lion among sheep, standing tall next to the graceful and delicate form of a woman who was tittering and fawning on him, the picture of every feminine excess that he desired.
"I am frightened for you, Will,"
Mina purred into his ear.
"Look at him. Even now he could be looking for someone to replace you. It is why they throw themselves at him, Will, because they know you are unsuitable for him, and he will soon find a way to be shed of you."
Will took a steadying breath. When Hannibal turned suddenly, his amber eyes catching Will's own, he dropped his gaze and turned his face away in time with Mina, both of them turning to give him their backs.
"Don't fret, darling," she cooed, tugging him to walk with her. "You are clever and resourceful, Will. If you are alert and know what he is about, then he might not get the best of you."
"He wants an heir. At least I think he does. His sincerity is suspect and his humor is ghastly, so it is difficult to tell."
"Then you must forbear giving him one,"
Mina quickly said, and tugged on him to chide him.
"Come now, Will, use your gift. You have seen enough of him to see yourself through his eyes."
"Rather more than that, Mina, I'm afraid. I have bonded to him." She stopped again. She was breathless with dread when she said, "Will, you never—"
"I couldn't control it," he said, a poor defense. "Mina, my gift, my curse, was bearing on me, and he was rightfully displeased with me, and it just happened."
"He terrified you into it, is that what you mean?"
she asked, and lay her hand along his cheek to pet him.
"My darling, what a terrible reward for your love of me you've been given. A one-way bond to a man who detests you is a pitiable and terrible thing. No wonder you're so wan. No colour in your cheeks, no life in your eyes, my poor dear."
Will flinched from her assessment, but accepted it as he had always accepted her.
"Mina, is that why you were so frightened when Mr. Stamets came with the contract?"
Will asked, his voice a pained, soft whisper.
"Because you were afraid he would do the same to you as he had to the former Lady Clarges?"
There was sorrow in her blue eyes as she gazed at him, but no contrition, only the sharp determination of self-preservation that Will had suffered for more than once in their childhood.
"You understand, Will, don't you?"
she asked, softly and gently, as if imparting the sweetest of life's secrets.
"Why I would wish to avoid him? You understand your place with him as well, how fragile it is, how he sees you?"
"Yes, Mina, I know it very well,"
he said, breathing the truth that she wanted to hear.
"So you understand how I worry for you?"
"Yes,
"I beg you to have a care, Will," she said, satisfied that she had sufficiently delivered her warning. "I do not wish to lose my twin." "I will be as careful as I can, Mina," Will said, offering a tense, nervous laugh, his thoughts turning once more to his riding accident. "All things considered."
"To that end, darling, I am sending someone to keep an eye on things. I spoke with father, and he too is very concerned about your situation you found yourself in."
"Father—"
"No, don't be so surprised, dearest. You are his child in the end," she reminded him. "No matter his disappointment in you, he has no wish to see you buried before your time, and neither do I."
Will felt he could very much argue that point, but held his tongue as Mina said,
"Do you recall Francis, darling?"
"Vaguely," Will said, frowning. "We were very young when he left."
"Yes, we were,"
Mina said, pulling him back into motion on the path.
"But I found him some years ago and gave him employment in my household. He is invaluable to me, dedicated and loyal as he is, and he remembers you fondly."
"I cannot imagine why he would," Will admitted. "I hardly recall him."
"It is little matter,"
she said, waving his doubt away.
"I have dispatched him to Hertford House with instructions to keep you safe, and that is precisely what he will do."
"Mina," Will said, appalled, "you cannot possibly send another Alpha to Hertford House. The Duke would never stand for it. Hannibal would never stand for it. Even if it is a servant, he is still—"
"Tell them he is coming ahead of me, then,"
she said, smiling lightly, amused by his worries.
"Inform them I have decided to retire to the country to spend time with my darling brother."
Will hesitated a moment, questioning her motives when she had not once attempted to contact him in all this time.
"Will, are you terribly cross with me?"
she asked, able as always to sense his disquiet and guessing the cause. "Why would I be cross with you, Mina?" Will asked, hardly aware of the soft deference in his voice. It was so ingrained in him to cater to her.
"For pushing you into his bed in my place,"
Mina said, smiling when he blushed.
"For abandoning you to his nastiness and not speaking to you in 6 years."
"You have had a life to live, Mina, same as I," Will said, letting his strange distrust fade to the back of his awareness. "I imagined you were happy and enjoying yourself. That is all I hoped for."
"Ah, well, yes,"
she said, sighing heavily and leaning on to him.
"Life as Lady Rathmore was an enjoyable enough distraction, I suppose. Timothy and I do not suit so well as I imagined as a child, but that's neither here nor there."
After a pensive, troubled silence, Will asked, "Would you truly come and stay with me at Hertford House, Mina?"
"Darling, of course,"
she said, hugging his arm yet again, her touch a comfort he had missed for too long.
"I often thought of you over the years, shuttered away at that awful old house with only an old man for company. How lonely you must have been, my poor darling. I would be delighted to come and relieve your tedium. Oh, what fun we shall have together again, Will!"
She gave him another squeeze and pulled him back along the path, glowing with accomplishment. Hannibal was extremely unsettled by the way Will and his sister had been staring at him when he chanced to look up. It was eerie to see two such similar people so dissimilarly dressed, watching him with the same blue eyes, but one set narrowed and the other sorrowful. He wondered immediately what that woman, because a sister would have at least attempted a visit in the last 6 years, and none of Will's relatives had even tried, was filling Will's head with. Lucky for him, Will was too intelligent by far to be easily distracted from the facts, but Hannibal knew there were plenty of damning facts that could conjure Will's melancholy to the fore. In a matter of seconds, Hannibal could think of dozens, and that prompted him to say to the woman clinging to his arm, "Should you like to meet my spouse and in-law, Miss Green?"
"Your spouse?"
she echoed, too thoughtless to keep the surprise out of her voice.
"Lord Clarges, I'd no idea she was here. I am simply dying to meet her."
"Yes, just here," Hannibal said, dragging her towards Will and his sister, who had slowed to a stop once again. He could swear that when Will noticed them approaching there was sudden fear in his gaze, and Hannibal wondered at the cause. He had not seen such a thing from his spouse since his return, and had done nothing to his knowledge to provoke actual fear. By the time he reached them, poor Miss Green quite out of breath beside him from his pace, Hannibal was sure he had been mistaken. "Lord Clarges?" Will said, taking a step back in tandem with Mina, both of them rather alarmed by his sudden, urgent appearance. "My sister was just confirming her plans to take an extended stay in the countryside. Her guard will be arriving tomorrow ahead of her." "How lovely," Hannibal said, forcing a smile. I have no means to protest, considering. Excuse me. Introductions are in order. May I present Miss Green? Miss Green, this is my spouse.
So delighted to make your acquaintance, Lady Clarges.
Miss Green simpered, directing it at Mina, whose smirk returned full force. Gods, no, not that one, Hannibal corrected, turning her by her shoulders to face Will. I realize they are twins, but they are not so similar as all that. No, Will is my spouse.
Lord Clarges?
She asked, confusion stealing her smile when she beheld Will's stony, blank expression.
But, Lord Clarges, how on earth do you expect an heir?
Oh dear, Mina said, chuckling softly in a way that set Hannibal's teeth on edge.
I believe I see an acquaintance enjoying the music. If you will all excuse me.
Will's face tightened imperceptibly as his twin hastened away, and his mouth pressed into an alarmingly taut line. Hannibal was quite wise enough to his moods to read Will's agitation when he saw it, and frowned at the woman who was in serious danger of earning herself a trouting. Before he could point out the obvious, Miss Green cried out with utter, simple-minded realization,
"Why, you're O'Megan!"
Yes, Will said, his voice calm and steady despite the slight blush that graced his cheeks. Hannibal couldn't tell if he was embarrassed or about to plunge the unfortunately dim young lady into the nearby lake.
"But I'd heard that Lord Clarges wouldn't go near an Omega," she tittered,
looking to Hannibal for approval. I never said there weren't advantages, Will said, a slight quirk gracing his lips. A spasm of confusion marred her brow, and Hannibal cleared his throat to keep himself from laughing at her puzzlement. My darling girl, Hannibal said, wishing he could set her down, but unable to hold her own stupidity against her. I am sure you have simply misunderstood.
Have I? She asked and tittered nervously. I would simply die should I give offence.
And yet here you stand, Will said, ever so mild. Miraculous.
I beg, shall we?
Hannibal asked, sweeping Will past her. Are we late for something, Lord Clarges? Will asked, irritated by the jolt of nerves he felt when Hannibal took hold of him. I felt compelled to remove you before you drew blood from that ignorant, spoiled creature. Do try, Will, not to sharpen your claws on such a simpleton. She is no match for you in any regard, and is a dreadful gossip, simply dying about everything. She will carry news of your status far and wide. Interesting, Lord Clarges, how you defend that ignorant, spoiled creature for the very qualities which you revile in Omegas, Will observed, his stride quickening in time with his temper. I revile stupidity in any package, Will. Not exclusively Omegas. There are numerous important reasons why I do not associate closely with such people as Miss Green. I was made to understand, and thoroughly, that your revilement is exclusively for Omegas, Will said, unwilling to stop now that he had a chance to get some answers. It makes me wonder, Lord Clarges, what you must have suffered to make such associations. My suffering is none of your business, Hannibal informed him, escorting him back towards the manor house with every intention to set out for home, no matter the early hour. It is when it affects me, Will said, keeping pace with him despite their height difference. I think, considering I bear the brunt of the result, that I should know the source of your opinions. I will not speak on the subject 1 second longer, Hannibal said, his voice sharp and clipped. He was surprised when Will flinched again, but it was gone in a heartbeat. Still, there was no mistaking his tension, and it prickled Hannibal's instinct to protect him from what had made him so nervous. Such a quandary when he himself seemed to be the cause. Why do you flinch from me? He asked, alarmed when Will met his gaze with a challenge in his eyes, again steeling himself as if expecting violence. Will Graham, what on earth has come over you? Why are you suddenly acting as if you fear me? Will grimly tipped his head up and said, I will not speak on this subject 1 second longer, Lord Clarges. Hannibal drew up and opened his mouth to question him further, but was interrupted by Aunt Margaret waving them down from the upper garden where grandfather was greeting and visiting with acquaintances.
Hannibal, William, she trilled, hoisting her cane to get their attention. Do come here, please.
Her beckoning interrupted them, luckily, before any more harsh words were exchanged, but came far too late to prevent the damage that had already been done. The two of them took their places stiffly at grandfather's side, where Will put his hand on the Duke's shoulder, seeking to steady his nerves after what Mina had told him.
They were immediately surrounded by friends and family, all eager to meet Will, as well as speak with their long-absent future Duke. "And have you had the pleasure of meeting Miss Lowndes?" Aunt Margaret inquired, her innocent tone immediately making Hannibal suspicious.
"Yes, Aunt Margaret, we have. She's a very beautiful young lady and suits Anthony very well," Will said, calming somewhat when Hannibal's scent lost the smoky undertone of threat that seemed to coil around his senses. He felt less exposed here, with the stone wall to his back and Roland to one side, and tried not to be nervous of the people around him, many of whom had snubbed him 6 years ago.
"Lovely girl," Aunt Grace said, fanning herself. "We are very lucky she accepted our Anthony's proposal."
"Miss Lowndes will do quite nicely, provided she doesn't amuse herself by insulting Will again. I refuse to stand for it, and she should have better manners," Hannibal said to her.
"No, you simply cannot withhold your approval now, Hannibal," Aunt Grace said, rousing her temper in the wake of his statement. "Such a rare opportunity to find a young lady of her persuasion unattached. Your cousin is a very lucky boy, Hannibal, and I won't stand for you obstructing him."
"I have no other reason with that aside, Aunt Grace, and no intentions of ruining Anthony's chances for happiness," Hannibal said, risking a look at Will's tense, uncomfortable face. "Ruining one life is quite enough, I've learned." "2," Will softly corrected. "It has not been as exciting as your own, Lord Clarges, but I believe mine still counts as a life." "It was yours I was referring to," Hannibal said, noting how his eyes widened in a split second of surprise, a glimpse of the true Will beneath his reserve.
"Children,"
the Duke said, reminding them that they were not in private,
"some conversations are best left to the bedchamber, don't you think?"
Will blushed to the roots of his hair, and Hannibal sighed, wondering if he himself was half as provoking as grandfather sometimes could be. Will gradually relaxed, able to fade into the background of conversation as the afternoon crept on, and keeping an anxious eye out for his sister. Most of those gathered in the Duke's vicinity were family of one ilk or another to the Dimmons, and knew Hannibal very well, though they were mostly strangers to Will. It must have started to show in his expression. After a very short time, Hannibal leaned closer to ask, "Are you putting faces to names so far, Will?" "Yes," Will said, realizing the Duke had shifted his chair away, leaving Will in Hannibal's company, a little bubble of privacy in the press of people. "There are a great many of them. More than Anthony has mentioned."
"More than he is probably aware of," Hannibal said, smiling slightly. "Anthony has no great interest in the extended family. Something I suppose he will need to develop when he becomes master of Fernhill and Uncle Robert's."
"You're looking well, Lord Clarges. And is this the mysterious spouse we've all been hearing of?"
Will braced when his hand was suddenly swept up and delivered to a whiskered face for a wet and entirely inappropriate kiss. He looked down at his trapped hand and then transferred his bland gaze to the man holding it. Under his disapproving, offended stare, the man hastily dropped his hand with an uncomfortable chuckle.
"Darnell?"
Hannibal said, doing his best not to bristle, though the sight of that bounder taking liberties with Will's person mortally tested his self-control. The gleeful, predatory look on Darnell's face was only matched by the cunning expression Mrs. Darnell wore.
"Have a care with my spouse, if you please. Will dislikes being inexpertly handled,"
Hannibal said, knowing well enough that if Will wasn't in the mood to tolerate it, he certainly would make his displeasure known.
"Warning me off your pretty mate, my boy?"
Darnell asked, chuckling.
"As a matter of fact, I am,"
Hannibal said, ever so cordial.
"And that is Lord Clarges, in case it escaped you."
Will bristled next to him, but held his tongue out of respect for the Duke. He had no desire to embarrass or shame the man who had sheltered him these many years, if he could help it, but he chafed to remind Hannibal that he didn't need his dubious protection. Not any more.
"You needn't worry for him, Lord Clarges,"
Darnell said, openly leering.
"I don't bite."
"Oh, I have no worries for Will, Darnell,"
Hannibal said, his smile entirely indulgent, though beginning to strain at the edges with temper.
"He is more than capable of dealing with any man whose hands might seek to wander where they are most certainly not welcome. I only hope you won't test him in that regard. You will certainly come out the worse for it, well deserved though it may be."
Much to Will's surprise, Hannibal was serious, and was smirking at Mr. Darnell's consternation.
"Speaking of not welcome,"
Hannibal said, maneuvering the conversation to his advantage,
I believe you are acquainted with my spouse, Mrs. Darnell." Her sharp, unhappy face very nearly caught fire with the blush that filled her cheeks. "Will?" Hannibal asked, looking down at him so that Will was suddenly the focus of their attention. "Yes," Will said, tipping his chin a bit higher, his shoulders straight and stiff with pride. "We met at your soirée." "I'm afraid I don't recall," she said, her smile so forced and false, Hannibal was amazed it did not crack around the edges and fall right off her face. "I accompanied Lord de Marrière when I was newly married," Will said, considering her closely, knowing she knew him, and knew precisely how she had treated him. He could see the brittle fear in her face, the vacuous terror of stepping wrong in a society that could break her like an aged, dried twig. Terror of mistakes exposed, gossip turned back to bite, shamed and shunned for misguided attempts to fit in. He felt pity for her, selfish and self-important woman that she was, married to a lecher with a roving eye and no standards, trapped in a marriage as empty and meaningless as the good opinions she worked so hard to engender. An empty life spent half in fear and half in vicious enjoyment of the suffering of others, so long as she was not the target, never the target, and that was why they always looked, all of them, searching restlessly to find others' faults to paper the cracks in their own character. "I imagine you would not remember it," Will said, seeing relief fill her eyes. He waited for a heartbeat and added, "I had certainly forgotten all about it. One soirée is very much like another, I fear." "Yes," she said, her pride offended, but she didn't dare give it away. "I do hope you will attend future events, with my warm welcome, of course. We would be so delighted to have you." "I have very little doubt of that," Hannibal said, immensely enjoying the frank irritation on Mr. Darnell's face as he realized what was happening. "Thank you, that is very kind. However, my time is very precious, and I am afraid I do prefer to spend it on things which are important enough to warrant the loss." Hannibal's brows rose as he grinned, saying with pleased indulgence, "Will has been running Hertford House for grandfather these past 6 years. I am afraid he has very little time for provincial gatherings, as his presence will be in such high demand when the season commences, now that the estate is in such good working order." "Is that the Baileys?" Mrs. Darnell asked, peering intently anywhere but at Will for anything that might offer polite escape from the line of fire. "Yes, I believe it is," Mr. Darnell said, quick to throw in his support. "If you will excuse us, Lord Clarges." They departed with near immediacy. Hannibal smiled at them as they eased away, his hand falling to the small of Will's back without his permission or awareness. Will stiffened slightly, an unintentional response to his own nerves. He wasn't entirely sure how much store to set in what his sister said, but he couldn't discount it out of hand either. His cut girth-strap had been no accident. He could not in good conscience condemn Hannibal without proof, but there was no convincing his tightly strung nerves of that. Hannibal didn't retreat, not while the Darnells were still casting uncertain, assessing looks their way as they merged back into the crowd. The moment they were out of eyeshot, however, Hannibal dropped his hand. Will's continued nervousness did not escape him, nor did his relief when Hannibal put some space between them. Will's mate was frightened of him, just as he'd suspected. He was hiding it well, but he was frightened nonetheless, and Hannibal hadn't the first idea how to address it. "Mrs. Darnell will certainly think twice before crossing you in the future," Hannibal said, noting that Will seemed somewhat overwhelmed on top of the anxious nervousness that kept him looking restlessly at the crowd. There was tension around his mouth, and a strain in his voice that had no business being there. Despite not wishing to upset his spouse again, Hannibal decided to take the chance while he had it, and take Will somewhere quiet, with the vague idea he might be able to get to the heart of whatever had scared him. Hannibal wasn't entirely sure how to approach the subject, but if anything he would at least see that Will got a much-needed break from the festivities. Gods knew Hannibal could use one. He lightly touched Will's elbow to get his attention, and waited for Will's troubled gaze to lift to his own. "Don't object, please. Just come quietly," he said, steering Will behind a row of potted shrubs, past the alert servants, and through an unmanned door. Once inside, he took Will directly to the Fernhill library, which was blessedly empty. He let go of Will's arm the moment he was able, hoping to prevent another swell in Will's sudden, strange fear of him. No one had marked their absence, Hannibal noted with relief. He closed the door quietly,
and when he turned he saw that Will was already a good measure less tense just being away from the crowds.
"You need to tell me when things become too much, Will. You aren't used to these things after all, and I do not relish my relations to such an extent that I cannot bear to be out of their company."
"It would not seem terribly intelligent of me to bring more of my faults to your attention, Lord Clarges," Will said, his voice quiet but his tone as feisty as ever.
"If growing weary of my pushy sea of scolding relatives is a fault, Will, then it is one we share,"
Hannibal said, moving closer, and frowning when Will moved further away. Wondering just what on earth Lady Rathmore had whispered into Will's ear, and hoping to get to the truth of it, Hannibal remarked,
"You're as skittish as a fawn, Will Graham."
"But not as harmless as one," Will warned him, shooting a sharp look over one shoulder. He moved to the bookcase and began to look over the selection. He landed on a volume with soft exclamation of surprise, and pulled it free, saying, "I was reading this very book at Hertford House. If you've no qualms, Lord Clarges, then I will spend some time quietly here."
"My only qualm is that you expect me to leave,"
Hannibal said, and bluntly added,
"I refuse to go back out there. I am thoroughly exhausted of them all."
That won a brief, small smile from Will. "They have not had a chance to visit with you, Hannibal, for so long, considering you were gone at war for near 10 years, and then put them off 6 more.
"Hannibal! Will, dear, where are you?"
Hannibal glanced about in half a panic, judged the settee too small to hide them both, and promptly went to the window. "What are you doing?" Will hissed, skating a wild-eyed glance at the door as footsteps and Aunt Grace's unmistakable voice neared. Hannibal forced the pane open and slung his leg out. Pausing there with one foot to freedom, he held out his hand to Will and asked, "Are you coming?" Will hesitated, momentarily too surprised to respond. The great Lord Clarges, Marquess and future Duke, slipping out of a window like a thief to escape his relations. Will stifled his laugh, but couldn't hide his slight amused smile. Hannibal certainly didn't seem like a man plotting murder, just a man who had experienced quite enough familial chastising for one day to suit him. It was a split-second decision on Will's part. He blamed it on the compulsion of his bond rather than a slip in his own judgment, even knowing he should most certainly not be alone with Hannibal Lecter. Clutching his book to his chest, Will took Hannibal's steadying hand and followed him out onto the lawn.
"The trick," Hannibal whispered, slipping the window closed, "is to go somewhere they wouldn't think to look."
"I think parting from the other guests is a good start," Will remarked, flattening against the cool manor wall when the library door was flung open for a searching glance. After a long, long moment, Hannibal laced Will's fingers in his own and pulled him down the closest path, hoping they would not be seen. "Everyone is gathering on the lawn. We should join them. It was rude of me to wish otherwise."
"There's nothing rude about needing a bit of space, Will,"
Hannibal said, his hand warm and sure around Will's fingers.
"No, we will find a quiet place out of the sun for a bit."
His amber eyes slid to the lake and lit on the small armada of party boats servicing the otherwise occupied guests of Fernhill. They were fine rowing vessels meant for two, each with a billowing canopy to block the sun, and, luckily enough for him, all empty just now.
"Though I doubt it was under these circumstances," he said, hurrying towards them with Will close behind him. "I believe we can use one of those."
"One of these?" Will asked, surprised by the small boat Hannibal directed him toward. It was a delicate and lovely vessel with padding seats and plump pillows, for all the world a place for lovers to lounge alone. His cheeks flamed with brilliant heat. He was aghast at even the idea of it, the surprise momentarily overcoming the tug of his bond, so that the potential danger of his situation returned in a sudden rush. It didn't do so in time for him to avoid Hannibal's hands, however. He was caught around the waist and deposited into the boat like he was nothing more than a sack of potatoes. "Lord Clarges!" Hannibal moved in after him, forcing Will to retreat to the stern, skittering back over the rowing bench to land in a pile of pillows on his backside. "Honestly!"
"You may lodge a complaint with me momentarily,"
Hannibal said, deftly unmooring the boat and pushing away from the small tie-on. He slid onto the rowing bench, planting his boots on either side of Will's spread legs, and promptly set about turning them.
"Your nerves are frayed. You need quiet."
"This is not helping," Will said, eyes blazing as he struggled to sit up, finally gaining a semblance of dignity by working the pillows into a seat of sorts, though he was scrunched into the stern. Hannibal focused on getting the boat turned and away from land on all sides, spared him a look, and said with a smirk,
"You look like an angry kitten."
"If you have brought me here to insult me—"
"Hush," Hannibal said, chuckling. "When you get furious it does not help your cause. Just relax and read your book."
Will glowered at him for a long moment, weighing his intentions. He didn't feel anything particularly murderous from Hannibal, no prickle of anticipation from him, no building determination to do him in. He just seemed himself, focused on rowing the boat without paying any particular attention to Will at all. Will tried very hard to reason that Hannibal, should he wish to do so, would never try to drown him here at his family's annual garden party. He doubted very much that it would be worth the cost of the scandal that would follow. Relaxing somewhat, Will settled back and opened the book with a prim air that made Hannibal chuckle all over again. "Your family will be furious," Will said after a long silence, his blue eyes lifting just slightly from his book to sneak a look at his husband again.
"They are gentle folk,"
Hannibal said, resting from his rowing to let the boat drift lazily toward the center of the lake.
"They will be furious quietly, within the bounds of common decency, and in the privacy of their own thoughts."
Will huffed a soft laugh at that, wriggling into a more comfortable position and stretching his legs a little. He made a soft sound of surprise when Hannibal let go of the oar to grab his ankle, but he just propped Will's booted foot up onto the bench next to his hip and patted it. Knowing he was tempting Hannibal to do the same to the other foot if he did not act, Will obligingly propped his other heel up next to it, finding the position quite comfortable for reading. The breeze was cool and the canopy kept off the sun. With everyone on the lawn for games, they were quite alone on the water. The frogs were singing their buzzing song in the shallows, and an occasional dragonfly inspected them. It was, in all, a peaceful quiet that Will desperately needed. He peered at Hannibal from the screen of his lashes, taking in his profile as Hannibal looked off toward the bank, his mouth pursed in thought and his sharp eyes flicking. It really wasn't fair for him to be so compelling. It was easy for Will to want to forget the truths between them when he looked at Hannibal, when those amber eyes observed him and that perfect mouth of his parted on a wolfish grin. He felt that tug within him, a strong pull to just push forward and wrap his arms around Hannibal's waist and enjoy it, and cursed his bond to Hannibal for pressing on him yet again, an irresistible call toward the crumbling bluff.
"You're smiling,"
Hannibal said, turning suddenly to catch his gaze, and sounding equal parts suspicious and amused.
"What on earth are you thinking about that has your cheeks so pink?"
"It's the heat," Will said, diverting his attention to his book, his face coloring even more.
"You do seem exceptionally flushed. Are you overheated?"
"I'm very well, thank you," Will said, finding it difficult to focus on his book when Hannibal decided to focus on him. Desperate to distract him, he asked,
"Shall I read to you, Lord Clarges?" "Goodness, how thoughtful," Hannibal said, cocking an eyebrow at him. "I find myself amazed you have not yet bashed me about the skull with the thing."
Will scowled and Hannibal grinned, saying,
"Please do. You have a very pleasant voice and all. It will be some little balm for the cacophony of my aunt's guests."
Will cleared his throat a little, immediately regretting his decision due to the awkward placement of where he had let off. He shuffled the pages, annoyed when Hannibal said,
"Pick up where you left off, if you please, Will. Perhaps that will explain your flush better than the paltry excuse of the heat."
Glowering at him, Will defiantly skimmed down to where he'd last been reading at Hartford and began. "Let one never forget, however, that vanity is the snake which bites the foot of the unwary man, and renders him insufferable to his friends. Indeed, the mark of a true gentleman is in his deportment, his character shown in what he does not say in place of what he could. Silence, dear friend, is the blessing of such a man, who holds his accomplishments dear and speaks not of himself. Do not fall prey to self-credit, to excesses of feeling or passions that might move others. Neglect that piece of yourself for your own betterment. Stand fast in your understanding that there is no greater weakness, no greater mark against a gentleman's character, than to abandon himself to base desires, and cling to what is outside of his own power and control. Limit thyself in such interactions, and be ever wary of promises that have no grounding in truth and reason."
"Even your reading material is bleak,"
Hannibal said, wrinkling his nose. "Did you expect a romance novel?" Will asked, relieved that Hannibal had not been paying too close attention. "Or something a child might read, simplistic and rhyming?"
"Behave,"
Hannibal warned, amused by Will's dour look. It gave him some little hope that he had been wrong, and that the fear he'd thought he'd seen was merely the result of too many demands on Will in an unfamiliar environment. It was hope enough that he did not break their momentary truce with questions that would upset his spouse.
"That is not an instruction for gentlemen, William. That is an instruction for monkhood."
Abstinence from excessive feelings has its merits, Lord Clarges, Will said, irritated by his summation. This book was much present in my childhood, your opinions notwithstanding. My father found it an excellent example for me.
Your father sounds delightful. Was he buried at the time?
That is not funny.
Gods forbid we find levity, Chapelain Graham,
Hannibal said, prodding him until he saw the familiar gleam in Will's eyes that usually preceded a caution by mere seconds.
Lucky for me, I have both the oars, and you value that book too much to slap me with it.
I am weighing the satisfaction of doing so against my host's attachment to it, Will warned him. Hannibal smirked, well amused by his steady stare.
Be very careful, Will. You're nearly falling prey to excesses of feeling or passion.
Will's glare deepened, but he refused to rise to the bait, much to Hannibal's disappointment.
Being wary of promises that have no grounding in truth and reason is an excellent method to avoid harm,
Hannibal said, frowning softly as he turned the words over in his mind, recalling each word merely from the remembered inflections of Will's voice as he had spoken them. He examined them against his own experiences.
It is, however, the most dismal approach to love I have ever been exposed to.
For those of us who have not been exposed to love, Will said, irritated that Hannibal had been paying closer attention than he'd first assumed, it is a dire warning well heeded. Had I been silly enough to encourage feelings for you before we met, then how much worse would it have gone for me once we did cross paths? The foolishness of my youth was tempered by such thoughtful and experienced warnings as those in this book.
And what of the foolishness of your adulthood?
Hannibal asked, unwilling to risk Will's further ire by questioning him on how he felt as a newly married bride. He was no wizard, able to reverse time and change what had already passed. No, it was the youth before him he was interested in. Perhaps through him, Hannibal could make amends to the boy he'd been. Adulthood has proven that I was right to be so cautious, Will said, closing the book with a snap, as I have seen those around me greatly reduced in their circumstances for the folly of such notions as love. Lives have been ruined and altered beyond repair, not just those of the lovers, but of their children and families. It is a ridiculous notion that gives rise to ridiculous behavior.
So it is unseemly to love?
Hannibal asked, intrigued. Of course it is, Will said, remembering himself and turning his face away to look out at the water. Familial affection is ingrained in us, but to step beyond that is to encourage destruction.
Or retribution?
Hannibal fished, watching him closely.
Do you believe, Will, that there is some power outside of yourself who seeks to destroy any happiness or relief you may find?
Will's sharp glance confirmed his suspicions, and Hannibal softly said,
That is a very sad thing indeed.
I do not require your pity, Lord Clarges, nor your observations, Will said, his voice stiff, embarrassed to have given away one of his deepest held beliefs. The circumstances of my life have taught me quite well enough what I may expect in my future. Not everyone gets a happy ending. Hannibal held his gaze, wondering at the sudden challenge he saw in Will's fierce blue eyes, almost as if he expected an unpleasant reaction in return. Wishing to allay him just a little, Hannibal said,
Well, certainly not with that attitude.
Will blinked, startled. He had expected Hannibal to respond to his statement, to realize that Will knew about the saddle and his intentions. He did not expect such a droll reply, and it baffled him. It made him wonder if, just perhaps, Hannibal had not been the one to cut his girth strap after all. But if not his husband, then who?
Had I any notion that such a power existed,
Hannibal said, leaning slightly closer,
I would thumb my nose at it. I would chase love to the ends of the earth, drown myself in happiness, and dare it to attempt to strip it from me.
Mystified, Will read his belief in his expression. Indeed, he could see that was just how Hannibal truly did live his life, spitting in the eyes of the gods and doing as he pleased, secure in his own power. They wouldn't dare take anything from you, he whispered, seeing the pattern through the course of Hannibal's life, defiance after defiance. Not in marriage, nor station, nor study would he be anything other than precisely what he wished. You have elevated yourself to their level, and they are afraid.
But you aren't?
Hannibal murmured, unabashedly pleased. Will started, shaking his head slightly as he cast off his empathy, a potential of understanding that never quite bore fruit. He clutched his book to his chest and murmured, I would not say that I am not, Lord Clarges. but my fear is tempered by my understanding of how little you fear in return." His blue eyes shifted, mournful and beautiful and sparkling like jewels beneath his thick lashes. "A man who fears nothing is capable of anything." "Indeed," Hannibal said, his gaze dropping to Will's soft mouth, to the stubborn tuck of his lower lip, as if nature herself had known what he would become and had armed him accordingly. He thought of their faux kiss in the hedge maze then, how warm Will had been and how calmly he played along, and his heart picked up an answer. He leaned closer, his strange intensity affecting Will, who pushed back into the stern, automatically folding his legs back to frame a wall between them. "What are you doing?" Will asked, brandishing the book between them. "Why are you alphas always sniffing people?" "I'm not sniffing you, I'm examining you," Hannibal said, congratulating himself on his inspired quick thinking. "You're flushed. You might be overheated, in which case all this," he gestured at Will's neckerchief and jacket, "would need to come off." "I will do nothing of the sort," Will said, appalled, and lurched sideways in an attempt to find a more dignified and proper position. The boat bobbed hard with his movement and shifted. Hannibal swayed forward on the bench to catch his balance, not expecting the sudden motion, and Will reacted instinctively. Without thinking of the consequences, he shoved back against the man tipping toward him, and sent Hannibal tumbling over the side of the boat into the green-tinged water with a huge splash. "Oh my goodness!" Will gasped in horror, shocked, eyes wide. He dropped his book and grasped the side of the rocking boat, leaning over to look down at the frothing water. "Hannibal! Hannibal!" Hannibal surfaced, sputtering and treading water, just as surprised as Will was. It was not, however, until he glared at Will that Will felt the first stirrings of amusement, and clapped his hands over his mouth in a vain effort to hold it in. "Will Graham," Hannibal said, blowing water out of his face, his wet hair hanging around his forehead, "if you laugh, I swear to all the gods—" Will's laughter escaped him then, undone by the stern warning from a man trying to be dignified while treading water. He hitched with laughter, squeezing his sides, his slender shoulders shaking and tears welling in his blue eyes. "You violent little harpy," Hannibal cursed, but felt a smile curve his lips in response to Will's laughter. He'd never seen him so undone, and his laughter was infectious, carefree and raspy, without the edge of the sardonic bite that always seemed to tinge his throaty voice. He grasped the side of the boat to steady it, and looked up at his spouse, asking with a grin, "Are you enjoying yourself?" Will laughed helplessly, wiping his cheeks with his hands and trying to get himself under control. Once the worst of it had passed, he tentatively moved to the side of the boat where Hannibal was clinging and offered his hand, saying with burbling laughter, I am so sorry, Lord Claudius. Let me help you out." Hannibal looked up at him, at his open face which finally looked his age for a change, no shadow clinging to his eyes, no tension around his mouth. He looked so damnably innocent it pained Hannibal to think of how much he had done to tear that from him. His aloof and easily riled mate who believed that happiness was a tool the gods used to punish those who dared reach for it, and lived a thin, measly thread of a life bereft of any comforts when he should be drowning in them. Seized with an impulse he couldn't ignore, Hannibal reached up for him, his wet, warm fingers sliding into Will's curls to curve behind his ear. Startled, Will found himself not pulling away, his heart hammering in his ears and his eyes glued to Hannibal's. The strange, intense look on his husband's face held him captive, and the soft, unexpected touch vibrated through his skin. He shivered and blamed it on the slight breeze, but knew the true reason was the gentle brush of fingers against his face. "What are you doing?" he asked, his laughter fading so that the words were barely better than an exhale. "I didn't steal a kiss in the maze," Hannibal said, a slight smile on his lips. "I should very much like to rectify that." "May I rectify that?" "There are no witnesses here, Lord Claudius, no crowd to impress or deceive." "Then we are all the better for being alone." Will's pulse sped despite himself, even as his common sense urged him to pull back, to grab the oars and row away because Hannibal very likely wanted him dead, and this would be such a perfect chance. But even that cliff threatening him deep inside of his soul could not still that soft shiver that coursed through him when Hannibal pulled up against the side of the boat with every clear intention to kiss him. Hannibal's fingers curved around the boat and tugged him closer, lips parting. Will's eyes flew wide and he uttered a stifled, enticing little yelp that made Hannibal's blood rise to a boiling point in an instant. Hannibal's tug shifted Will's center of balance, and he fell in the small craft pushing away from him.
Having taken all the abuse it could handle, it promptly tipped, dumping Will gracelessly out on top of his husband before righting itself to drift off in a bobbing wave. Hannibal only just barely managed to keep them both from going under, and hitched Will up, cursing the damned boat for interrupting a moment so ripe with potential. "Well, hell!" Will spat, his hands gripping Hannibal's shoulders and his slender legs churning the water. He was entirely too close, smashed to Hannibal's chest as he was. He could feel the warm muscle of Hannibal's forearm against the small of his back, steadying him, somehow worked beneath his jacket, which floated up behind him. Hannibal grinned, one outflung arm balancing him, finding it easy enough to stay afloat with Will's little legs paddling as furiously as they were. He was also delightfully disgruntled and temptingly close, doing his damnedest not to look at Hannibal, even though they were nose to nose. "And there goes an oar," Hannibal remarked, watching it slide from its open oarlock and drift off on ripples from the boat's movement. "And the other as well." Will fought to turn, for any excuse not to be face to face after that strange and startling encounter, but Hannibal's grip on his waist was unrelenting. More distracting was that Will could feel the length of him from chest to belly. He was desperately relieved that their bodies were not pressed any closer below the waist, because he was certain he would not survive the embarrassment of it. He was so aggrieved that Hannibal chuckled, amused. "I'm glad you find this situation laughable," Will complained, making the mistake of tipping his face to Hannibal's. When he saw Hannibal's sharp-toothed grin, he couldn't help but return it with a lopsided one of his own, realizing the absurdity of their situation. "Tell me, Chaplain Graham, what about this situation is not laughable?" Hannibal asked, and when he laughed, Will chuckled in response. "Hold tight." Will held fast to his shoulders, his smile fading as his thoughts began to race. He stared at his own white fingers clenched on Hannibal's dark coat as his husband bore him through the green, murky water of the pond to reach the boat. His skin tingled where Hannibal touched him, and he fought the urge to touch all those same places, to see if some change would be felt in the texture of his skin, to discover if his own touch would wake a similar response, or if it was something uniquely conditioned to his husband. It preoccupied him so much as he was heft onto the side of the boat that Hannibal's hand on his backside came as a shocking surprise, so stunning that Will had no time to protest before he was levered up by that touch to tumble back within. He scrambled to his sodden knees, flailed a little while cursing the plump pillows that seemed everywhere, and finally managed to turn himself around to scowl at Hannibal. "If I attempt to crawl back in as you have," Hannibal said, using his grip on the side of the boat to guide himself to the stern, "I will capsize this unfortunately top-heavy creation." Will fell back on his backside and gripped the boat's sides as it began to turn. Cautiously, he made his way back to the stern where Hannibal was pushing, and just watched him thoughtfully for a moment as his efforts guided the light craft towards the shore. "Why did you do that?" Despite his panting, Hannibal managed to tell him, "Because it was the fastest way to get you back into the boat." "No, Will flushed and broke off, wondering why he was prodding. "You're my spouse, Will," Hannibal said, realizing what he was getting at. "There will be a bit more than an unfinished kiss between us before it's said and done." Will's eyes widened, but he got that stubborn look on his face that Hannibal had so quickly come to relish. Grinning, he added, "I understand it might make you nervous, considering you've never been kissed before." Will's chin tipped up, and he retreated from view. When he heard Hannibal's satisfied, delighted laughter, however, he flung himself back to the stern, and leaned over it with a nonchalance he did not quite feel, to say, "It so happens, Lord Clarges, that I have no interest in kisses, unfinished or otherwise. I find the whole idea of it terribly dull." "Terribly dull?" "Yes," Will said, prim as a schoolmarm despite the telling pink in his cheeks. "I doubt the inconveniences required to create a child could even distract me from my book." He cracked said book open again, having retrieved it a little worse for wear from its trip, but still usable, and felt for a change that he had managed to render Hannibal speechless, which left him rather satisfied. "Is that a challenge?" Hannibal asked, panting hard as he worked to bring the boat to shore. It didn't stop him from grinning, however, well pleased with his little mate. "Or shall we set a bet?" "What?"
"A bet," Hannibal said, feeling the soft slurry beneath his feet solidify to gravel and packed earth as the pond shallowed, "on whether or not I can distract you from your book." Will slammed it closed again, heart racing and mouth tingling at even the suggestion of such a thing. But it could work to his advantage. When he considered the bare facts, there was no danger in such a silly bet.
Hannibal would not win. The likelihood of them ever sharing a bed was less than 0, and even should they do so, Hannibal would surely be unable to overcome his revulsion to perform any such act, let alone successfully. On the off chance that he did manage to somehow win, his own deeply ingrained distaste would keep Hannibal from anything more than puffing up like a peacock and crowing of his victory. "If I win, you will stop pestering me with such tenacious constancy," he stated, deciding it was worth the risk. Hannibal's brows rose, impressed. "If I win, you have to let me kiss you whenever I like." "Whenever you like?" Will echoed, thinking that didn't sound like a prize at all. "Are you sure you're not confused? Perhaps if you win—" "Whenever I like," Hannibal firmly repeated, getting his feet solidly under him and standing to shove the boat toward the dock. "Very well," Will said, holding the book carefully away from him and sliding to the rowing bench as Hannibal brought them to shore. "You have yourself a bet, Lord Clarges." Hannibal's grin was so triumphant and woke such a clamor in Will's nerves that he immediately wished he could take it back. Little as he liked to admit it, if there was any one person on this earth who could rattle Will Graham, it was certainly his eccentric and overbearing husband.